If you're a big employer, it's almost inevitable that you definitely have some people that would be very affiliated with Genspect organisations in your workplace. These are parents of distressed kids. These are children of transitioners. These are incredibly unhappy divorced partners whose husbands, frankly, got very absorbed in a fetish, and these are detransitioners who medically transitioned and tried to reverse the process. Something about the workplace isn't giving room for people who are in distress about this and who aren't saying it's all brilliant. So this kind of almost toxic positivity, there is only positive. Give some room to the fact that there's detransitioners and parents who are really in very complex positions in the workplace.
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Okay, hi Stella. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me on.
Am I right in thinking that this is the first interview that you've ever done that's specifically for an employer audience?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it is, yeah.
Okay, well, welcome to the world of HR.
Not a world I'm very experienced in. It frightens me, HR.
Gosh, really? Okay. Well, listen, I'm hoping the crossover of our expertise is going to result in a really interesting conversation. So I'm really pleased to have you here. Having just called it an interview, do you mind if I just hog the mic just for a little bit, just to put this in context? I just want to make sure that I've framed this conversation properly, because I think we might all be at slightly different points in thinking about this. So, okay, I've detected a shift in the last year or so and a growing realization among employers that I think they need a wider lens on what they've been calling trans inclusion and to consider a broader range of perspectives. In my view, what happened is that looking back, employers accepted at face value the idea that this was an extension of the gay rights movement. And they were really keen to be on the right side of it, as well as genuinely wanting to help their staff who are identifying as trans or non-binary. Now, my memory is, and others may disagree a little bit, that around 2017, 2018, perhaps a little bit earlier, campaigning organisations that employers trusted, like Stonewall in the UK, suddenly seemed to be everywhere. And they were presenting a lot of new information about what was the kind, modern, progressive way of looking at sex and gender. We were told all about gender identity and how some people can be born in the wrong body and how some people require a medical pathway to live as their authentic self in their true gender. No alternative perspectives were ever presented. In fact, Stonewall's famous slogan was "no debate," which basically meant that it was immediately impossible for HR professionals to raise any doubts or questions. So usually the training sessions, and I went to a few of them, were rolled out kind of company-wide. And the typical format was to have an external speaker who was almost always trans-identified themselves, say from Stonewall, or I made a little list here, Trans in the City, Global Butterflies, Mermaids, Transactual, the Diversity Trust, LGBT Youth Scotland, Pink News. They would sort of present the main content. And usually alongside them on a panel was a collection of young trans-identified employees from the company who were always really charming and smart and funny. And they made a really compelling case for how their colleagues could help them to feel supported and welcome at work. Probably wasn't totally clear, if I'm honest, why this was an HR issue, other than it being part of a broader trend of kind of inclusion and well-being at work, which had really taken off around that period within HR. So this was also a time when the broader culture seemed to be moving in that direction as well. So we had Caitlyn Jenner. In the UK, we had Hayley from Coronation Street. We had Conchita Wurst winning the Eurovision. Hope you're not struggling to keep up with all my highbrow cultural references there. I actually loved that Conchita Wurst song. Was it Rise Like a Phoenix? I was totally into it. Anyway, it was a great song. It was a great song. So at the time, sort of senior HR professionals were happy to be led by the kind of lived experience of all these people and the general zeitgeist, and all their junior colleagues more broadly. And to be honest, I don't think they really saw any issue with granting these requests for accommodations. So that's when practices like pronoun declaration came into the workplace. We know also that they were incentivized by things like the Stonewall Workplace Equality Index, which is a list of the top LGBT inclusive employers in the UK. And there were lots of other glitzy awards events, which were often championed by senior stakeholders within the organisation who seemed to feel particularly passionately about these issues. So there wasn't really any space to raise any questions or concerns about any of this. So where are we now? Cut to 2025, and it's becoming clear this has turned out to be much more complex than employers had initially thought. So HR professionals are telling me that more and more employees are voicing objections to policies and practices that were designed to be kind of trans inclusive. So things like using facilities that align with someone's gender identity rather than their biological sex. And also gender diversity training sessions being run by people who are still openly promoting puberty blockers, for example, even though these have been now banned in the UK. At the same time, we've got some LGBT internal staff networks have become increasingly vocal and demanding in various ways, in ways that I don't think they always were. So clearly, basically, nobody wants all this aggro in the workplace. And for HR teams, this stuff can be really time consuming and also really expensive, especially if legal issues escalate to an employment tribunal, obviously. I think there was a recent case with the UK Civil Service and a staffer called Eleanor Francis. And there's also a case with 5 nurses at a hospital in Darlington in the northeast of England, which is, I think, ongoing now. So there's the legal side of it. And there's also retention is another issue. So if staff feel that their objections are handled badly, I think that could be enough to prompt them to start looking for another job. So that's a considerable amount of financial cost for the employer, losing an experienced person and also having to recruit and train their replacement. So just very quickly, who is objecting and why? Employees are starting to voice discomfort on all sorts of grounds. So, for example, religious or so-called gender-critical beliefs. And we know there are legal issues that follow on from that, which is definitely a podcast for another day for a legal eagle. I've invited you here today because I think there is also a lot of other groups of employees that are even more directly impacted by this issue and that most employers simply have not thought about, like, at all. So here I'm particularly thinking about people who have someone in their family who's adopted or declared a trans identity and where there hasn't been such a positive outcome for the family at all. I think it's likely that at least some of the employers who think they're being, in quotes, inclusive in their approach are actually causing significant pain and distress to some of their own staff without even realising it. And I think they'll find that a pretty horrifying thought, actually. So I'm hoping you could tell us a bit more about these groups in a moment, and we could kick around some ideas about what might be happening in the workplace and how to move forward from here. But first, can I start with asking you about Genspect, which is the organisation that you run? What does it do, and what exactly is your kind of expertise and experience personally?
Well, Genspect is an international organisation, and we offer a healthy approach to sex and gender. And when we say a healthy approach, our emphasis is on a non-medicalized approach, and it's very much rooted in the fact that I'm a psychotherapist. And if, for example, you have depression or anxiety, and if you went to a psychiatrist, you would be given medication very often, or certainly that would be the point of going to a psychiatrist. When you go to a psychotherapist, you're more interested in the non-medicalized approach, which is maybe talking, maybe building your social skills, building your relationships, figuring out maybe whether you're happy at work or not, and looking at the wider context of the problems of living. And so bringing that kind of non-medicalized approach to sex and gender, our emphasis would be for anybody with gender dysphoria would be could you, for example, be a boy who presents as a girl without medicalizing? Do you need to take medication to present as the person you want to be? Or could you, play around with self-expression, dresses, makeup, whatever, and vice versa for girls who want to present in a more masculine way? And so we're certainly very open to different types of expression. But we think that medicalizing the body to change the way you look is incredibly harmful on your physical. It carries a very heavy burden physically, and it also carries a heavy burden psychologically. And so there are easier ways to approach it. We have a lot of different branches. We run educational programs. We run kind of CME, which would be continued medical education kind of courses for people who want to learn about how to kind of maybe clinicians or nurses or youth workers who want to learn about our approach. We also run conferences to kind of bring different perspectives to the general public as much as possible. We have a therapeutic wing where parents or people who've been impacted by medical transition can have therapeutic group support. And also we give some funding for one-to-one therapy. As well as that, we have a lot of digital content that is continuously trying to bring a kind of a broad-minded perspective that, you know, thinks of the greater good and is low interventionist to the public, because we believe that in many ways people presume gender dysphoria equals medicalization, and there's no grounding in science with that. So we're very evidence-based. We're very much grounded in, well, what's working best.
You mentioned just gender dysphoria a couple of times there. That's this sense of discomfort with the body that you're in and maybe wishing you're in a different body. Is that right? So you don't believe that sense of discomfort comes from being born in the wrong body. You don't believe in any of this idea that trans is an innate identity, or that there's this kind of mismatch between sex and gender. You just don't. That's just not your view of what's going on. Is that right?
It's a little bit more complicated than that. No, we don't believe that you can be born in the wrong body. We are born as our bodies and in our bodies, and there is no other option of any other body. No more than can you be born in another head. So no, that's not a phrase that we agree with. And also, by the way, an awful lot of, I think all the pro-trans organizations now don't agree with born in the wrong body. They accept that it's one of those phrases that is a good way of expressing a feeling, but it actually has no basis in reality. Like, when your body dies, you die. When your body is born, you're born. There isn't other optional bodies to choose from. Having said that, we do understand that gender dysphoria, which is this kind of sense of distress, and for some people it's very profound and very chronic sense of distress, that I should be somebody different. I should be, for example, non-binary, or I should be a man. And we agree that this seems to absolutely cripple some people mentally, that it really, really does seem to be very distressing. And, you know, by the way, it comes, you know, why did I get involved was because I had what would now be diagnosed as gender dysphoria as a child, and I had it for many years. So I do understand that feeling of being born and thinking I should be a boy, because I certainly felt it for many years. And had there been such a thing as puberty blockers when I was a child, I would have really, really definitely been on the list to get them, because of the way I presented, because of the way I acted for many, many years. And I'm glad that I learned to accept my body. I'm glad that I learned to become accepting of myself. It wasn't an easy process. It was actually a very difficult process, one of the most difficult of my life. But I'm glad I went through it, because it's easier to accept yourself than to massively change yourself, especially when your body weakens in that change. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah. So you don't believe anything like this kind of pink brains and blue brains
Oh,
mismatch thing. There isn't any science behind any of that. Is that, in your opinion? Because this is still some of the messaging that we're getting coming through to employers, and we just kind of, you know, tend to believe people at face value if that's what they
yeah.
say. But
No, we you know, we're very much rooted in the evidence, and there is no supporting evidence to say that there's some sort of kind of almost gendered soul within us, and the gendered soul is either pink or blue or some other color. No, we think it's an interesting idea, but there's no evidence to support that. We don't believe that there's some sort of trans identity within people. I think a lot of people make a leap of logic that trans is like, you know, being gay in the 21st century. It's a new identity that we all have to get with the program about. And I would say that needs a little bit of thought and critical rigor, because being gay is something that is actually empirical. You can test it. So if you give pictures to somebody who's gay, their body responds towards the people that they're attracted to, and their body doesn't respond to the people that they aren't. So you can test it. It's also it's visible in the animal kingdom. It's actually something that is not culturally impacted. There's always a certain number of people who are same-sex attracted in any different culture. While being trans is massively impacted by culture. And so there's very high numbers in some societies, and it's literally non-existent in other societies. There is no equivalent of trans in the animal kingdom.
Sorry, I was going to say, mightn't, just the voice in my head is saying, mightn't people say, well, in certain cultures it's not acceptable to kind of come out as trans, and in other countries it is more acceptable. And so what we're seeing now, because there does seem to have been an increase, is as a result of it being more acceptable.
Without a doubt, there's some societies it's not acceptable to come out as trans. And yet it seems to be that there are some cultures that are, for example, quite homophobic, but have learned to assimilate certain identities within their culture. So if you look at Samoa, they have an identity called the Fa'afafine. And the Fa'afafine are males who are very girlish, very feminine, generally from childhood, and they wear dresses and they're accepted in society, and they ultimately grow up to be feminine presenting gay men. And it's a way of assimilating being gay in the Samoan society. And if you look at that, that's actually cross-cultural. There's the Mushe in Mexico. There's the Hijira in India. There's lots of different cultures that have assimilated feminine boys. When you look at trans as such, you could say there has always been a small number of people who, from childhood usually, would be the opposite sex presenting. Now, up until about 30, 40 years ago, those kids were basically suppressed and were told not to present like that, not to behave like that. But the statistics show about 70 to 80% of those children grow up to be same-sex attracted. Now, if you stop the sexual development of those children with puberty blockers, their ability to figure out that actually this was part of my lesbian identity that I wasn't aware of because I was 3 and I was 7 and I was 8. But actually, this was a lesbian identity that needed to be unearthed with my sexual development in my teens and in my 20s. So that's one reason why I would say one shouldn't medicate a very masculine presenting girl, because it's very likely she'll grow up to be same-sex attracted. So you're kind of interfering with a natural process of same-sex orientation. The other reason I would say is that, why can't girls be very masculine? What's wrong with that? Why can't boys be very feminine? Why would one need to medicate for it? Surely what we need to do is have a society where somebody can present as they wish. I have no problem with that, and Genspect has no problem with that. We have a problem with needlessly medicating your body so that it leads to impaired sexual functioning. So your ability to orgasm is massively reduced when you medically transition, with genital surgery, and your fertility is massively impaired to the point of you're infertile very often when you medicalize your gender expression. And as well as that, there's, cardiac troubles, there's osteoporosis. It's a heavy medical burden.
So if you don't believe that trans is a kind of innate identity, then what do you think is going on, particularly with young people initially? You mentioned same-sex attraction. Are there other kind of common coexisting factors with young people who are kind of saying that they're trans or non-binary?
Yeah. So what I think is going on is there's a lot of ways for humans to go in their mind, and gender dysphoria is a very severe form of distress. Some people have become anxious. Some people become depressed. There's lots of different ways. OCD, panic. There's lots of different ways that we channel our distress. People with mental illness are just as important and as valid as anybody else. So I don't buy it's stigmatizing to be considered that gender dysphoria is a mental illness. It's in the DSM. The DSM is kind of the Bible for psychology and psychiatry. There's anorexia, there's, mental illness. loads of them, depression, anxiety. And what we've noticed that people with gender dysphoria tend to have other illnesses. And that's another, going back to the point of me saying that people presume that gay and trans is the same thing, that they're so different, it's laughable. One is a sexual orientation, it's your attraction to other people. The other is a sense of self that's completely within. It's not testable, it's not empirical, it's not falsifiable, because if I say I am A or I'm B or I'm C, you've got no way to know it because it's completely subjective. And when you look at people who are same-sex attracted, there's no kind of high level of comorbidities with other issues. But when you look at somebody who has a trans identity, they have a very high level of comorbidities. For example, very high level of autism among people who identify as trans, very high level of ADHD. Now, if you look at those two neurodiverse conditions, you'll see that we've got a kind of hyperfixation, which is part of being kind of very much identifying as trans and not seeing other options, such as non-medicalized approach, as well as that it's black and white thinking, and it's a kind of, they don't sit well with metaphorical thinking. And so you might say, a black and white thinker would say, you have to use my pronouns. That's the only option. It's all black and white. It's good and bad. And somebody who understands psychology would understand that we need flexibility when we deal with other humans. Yes, it's very difficult for some people to have flexibility, but it's a key aspect, and any employer will know this. It's a key aspect of getting on in life, and we all have to somehow jog along. And so flexible thinking is a key aspect of mental health. And anybody with a neurodiverse condition is encouraged to learn that their black and white thinking can lead to a mental rigidity that can be very, very distressing for everybody involved. And so the high level of ADHD, of anxiety, of eating disorders, of autism, and of OCD among people who have identified as trans suggests, again, that this is a mental health condition that needs an awful lot of sympathy and compassion, but it doesn't need people to somehow believe that they've been born in the wrong body, that they're somehow wrong, and they need a lot of surgery to fix their wrongness. They don't. They can present any way they want.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick reminder to like and subscribe. It really helps new people to find us, and it means I can keep enticing great guests to join us. If you work in HR and enjoy the podcast and would value speaking to other employers who share an appetite for robust discussion, do get in touch with me via LinkedIn. We'll be launching a new community soon, so this is your chance to shape those plans. Okay, I'll let you get back to the episode. And did I read also that it can be a response to kind of trauma, like abuse and things like that? Not for everybody, but that can be a factor as well.
Yeah, I work a lot with detransitioners. That's another thing that Genspect does. We run a support system for those who've been impacted by medical transition. And so detransitioners are people who have medicalized and then decide to stop. And in lots of ways, they don't like the word detransition because they feel they can't reverse the process. These are people who've had mastectomies, who might have had genital surgery, who it would be a female who might have male pattern balding and hair on their chest, a mastectomy, hair on their bum and on their back, and a male voice. It's very hard to go back to presenting as a female, but they regret it. They feel that they didn't make the right decision. And now they're often feel like they're stuck in limbo. They're neither female presenting nor male presenting. And I've noticed, I run a kind of a regular group every Sunday, and it's called Beyond Trans because they've moved beyond trans. And they really, a lot of trauma led to their decision to medicalize. So a lot of the time, a lot of them have internalized homophobia. They didn't want to be gay. They didn't want to be lesbian. They just wanted to be an ordinary girl or an ordinary boy, and they thought they could be by medicalizing. And when you're different as a teenager, you get bullied very often, sadly, but it's true. And so they go online, and where do they find a community? They find a community online, and they learn this idea that I could be somebody different. I could be a boy. I could be a boy with a new name and a new identity, and I could leave behind that shamed girl who's called dyke and who's called all these words, and I could just become like that boy over there who's on YouTube who seems to be so cool. And so they medicalize. but it's really a trauma-driven response of isolation and seeking an identity when they're so distressed. And then as time goes on, very, very often I found the detransitioners I work with, very often it's not that they suddenly decide I should have been a woman all along. It's all the medical problems that they're facing. They find it doesn't make sense to them. They're like, well, if I'm a real boy, why wouldn't I be why is my body literally rejecting the testosterone? Why is it so hard on my body? And it's incredibly hard. About 5 years into testosterone, you're just often getting a series of UTIs, urinary tract infections. You've got an awful lot of pain. Orgasm is so painful you can't orgasm. And very often, about 5 years or so into testosterone, you need a hysterectomy because you've had so much pain in your private area. So as a result, they find that the medication has caused them more problems than anything else. And they realize, I didn't need to do any of that. This was something that I thought was a solution, but it's turned into more of a problem than a solution. And they stop their medicalization. And then they feel distressed because they think, I didn't need to do any of it. I could have just been a male presenting woman.
Hmm. And so those are mainly the younger people who we might see kind of in the workplace who are identifying as trans, who might be in the kind of LGBTQ kind of staff networks that they often have at these organisations. There's also quite often some older biological males who are identifying as trans women. I don't think there are a lot of older women who are identifying as trans men. But what's going on? Are these they seem like quite different cohorts compared with the younger people I've noticed in these groups when I've seen them on panels and things like that. Are they there for different reasons, or are there similarities?
So, if you think trans is simple, you don't know enough about trans. And there's an awful lot of different reasons why people seek medical transition. So there's the young person that I just described. There's various other reasons, but the one that you've just described there's a cohort, and they've always been there. They're well represented in films and books. And this would be the middle-aged male who has been heterosexual all his life, who often, by the way, they're very often autistic. They're very often in kind of techie jobs, often quite like uniforms, like so they might be in the military or they might be in, the Air Force. They like dressing up. They like costumes, as far as I can see. And they have developed a condition called autogynephilia. And autogynephilia is an erotic fixation with the idea of a male's erotic fixation with the idea of them being female. And that could be anatomical. So they might want to breastfeed, or they might want to, um, uh, do other behavioral things like sit down to pee and things like that. Or it could be very much just dress. So they might just want to wear certain dresses and present as a female in that way. It could be behavioral. They might want to be in a knitting circle or in a breastfeeding circle because it's all girls together, or be in the female toilets. And so the autogynephile is very much rooted in their paraphilia. Now, there's lots of different paraphilias. Males by far have way more paraphilias than females. And paraphilias they're debilitating conditions, but they're also something that society needs to be aware of. And one of Genspect's kind of operating branches is kind of build public awareness, just build public awareness about all the things that you and I are talking about right now. And one of the awarenesses we need to build is the concept of paraphilia. So voyeurism, a peeping Tom, that's a paraphilia. Exhibitionism, a flasher, that's a paraphilia. Obviously, pedophilia is a paraphilia. And autogynephilia is a paraphilia. Paraphilias can be very dangerous to the person and to others. And I say that with, complete compassion. I don't know why some people have a paraphilia. I do know that society needs to know about these paraphilias so that we can protect ourselves from them. I remember when I was a child, like I grew up in Dublin in the 70s and 80s, and my mother didn't know what paedophilia was when we were kids, until there was a campaign in the late 80s when I would have been a teenager. She kind of knew there was dirty old men, but she didn't know they had any interest in children. She was like, what the hell is that about? She didn't know it. Now, I'm not on any level equating autogynephilia with paedophilia. I'm talking about the concept of awareness raising and the idea of sometimes we need to be aware of different paraphilias. And if you weren't aware of them, you wouldn't understand what's going on. And when somebody has a paraphilia, they will often, they will allow it to consume their life, and they will go to great lengths to, carry out their paraphilic kind of desires. We need to be aware of that point. It's a completely different point from the teenager who wants to medically transition because they're lonely and isolated. It's a very different person. So I'm not saying on any level that everybody who's trans is autogynephilic. I'm saying one needs to be aware of autogynephilia if you're going to understand various different identities, trans identities.
The trans women, the older trans women that you're describing, are quite often in these panels, and they're quite often the head of some of the groups that I mentioned, like Trans in the City and people like that. Those sorts of groups, those sorts of people will absolutely deny there is any sexual element or any sexual motivation to them dressing in that way. I don't think a lot of them medicalized, but they will absolutely deny that, and they will say, and they're actually come across usually as kind of quite gentle souls, a little bit eccentric, but we just kind of take them at face value as being like, okay, well, I don't really get this. I probably would think you were a man if you hadn't told me that you wanted to be seen as a trans woman, but I'm just kind of going to go with it. Like, is there always a sexual element to it, or are there some of these people that are genuinely just a little bit kind of oddballs, for want of a better word?
Well, there's always oddballs in life. I think we always have to give room for the fact there's always going to be oddballs. So, no, I don't think they're all at all. There's definitely some people who are odd and some people who just like, presenting in the opposite sex. But there is a cohort. There's no doubt about it. I am sure that there's a lot of autogynephiles who understandably feel that they cannot admit that they're autogynephile and that they don't admit it to themselves. I think sex is weird. I think what turns people on is often very strange. I include myself in that. And that I think, yeah, they would deny it because they want to, more than anything else in life, they want to see themselves as female. That's what they're kind of motivated to do. They want to kind of live within the fantasy.
So would you not believe them if they say that they've had these feelings since childhood or since early adulthood?
Well, I urge anybody who wants to understand this is to read Anne Lawrence's book Men Trapped in Men's Bodies. Some of them say it began when I was 4 or 5 or 8 and I tried on my mother's tights and I felt a sensation I never felt before. And then I would secretly do it once in a while. But when puberty struck, it absolutely, went sky high as an urge. We're very, very basic and rudimentary in our understanding of autogynephilia because so many people are ashamed of it. So many people are horrified when people speak about it. So I think there's very little knowledge or understanding. But people lying about their sex life and what turns them on isn't new, and it's kind of farcical to think that people don't lie about what turns them on because we do all the time.
Hmm. Okay, so I mentioned in my introduction that I think there are several groups of employees that I don't believe employers have considered properly or, in fact, at all. And I think it'd be really helpful just to think about those people in the workplace and how things are going for them.
Well, in Genspect, we've run a few different support groups. We've run support groups for parents. We run support groups for siblings who've been impacted. And we also run support groups for people who've been impacted by medical transition. And every one of them regularly speak about the issues they have at work. It's a continuous in our groups. We have a group running every single day of the year. We've thousands in our database, and every single meeting will have somebody bring up issues at work. Very often people feel that when there's a kind of a concerted campaign around LGBTQ issues, that there's very little room for people who have been harmed and who feel distressed around it. So, for example, only on Sunday somebody was talking about how She's working in a pretty, standard restaurant. She's a waitress. She's detransitioner, and they're very pro pride and LGBTQ flags. And she talks in the meeting regularly about how she's been harmed by that, because when she was young and vulnerable, she thought this was the solution. And so constantly talking about LGBTQ without referencing the fact that some people are some people are detransition, some people are desisters. Desisters are people who don't medicalize but who push back and realize that they don't have a trans identity, having first thought that they had. They might be 10 years identifying as trans and then they stop. And so she feels very upset that there isn't any room for the detransitioner. When she tells people that she's a detransition, work don't know what they don't know what it is. And one of the services we run at Genspect is an advocacy service where we would write to employers on behalf of different people. And the most common asked for letter to employers is to explain to somebody who's starting at work, to say, this person is a detransitioner. They are medicalized. However, they are no longer identifying as trans. And just so you know, they do present in an unusual way because she's got a male voice, but she is female. Just to let you know, in case you've got questions. And time and again, and I can't believe I'm telling you this, but it's happened so many times. The employer seems to kind of do a half-baked cursory reading of the email, which is as clear as crystal, often backed up with an extra kind of article and stuff. And they read it as, this is a trans woman. They think, oh yeah, LGBTQ, yeah, we're LGBTQ. And so they see male presenting kind of female and they think that she has been born male and she transitioned to female. And it's like, no. It's unbelievable how many times that has happened. The second most common would be parents who are at work, might be in a media company. That occurs to me recently. She's a producer in a media company, and they're regularly doing interviews for very pro LGBTQ, very pro kind of children medicalizing. And her child is profoundly autistic and has deep OCD and has acquired cross-sex hormones on the internet and took them without the parents' permission. And it has caused no end trouble in this child's life. And the parent is very angry at what her child was sold over the internet. And so as a result, she said to me, like recently, I keep on taking days off work whenever they do these interviews because there's no room for the parents to stress. So yeah, there's a lot of incredibly distressed and angry people who don't feel able. Something about the workplace isn't giving room for people who are in distress about this and who aren't saying it's all brilliant. So this kind of almost toxic positivity, there is only positive. Give some room to the fact that there's detransitioners and parents who are really in very complex positions in the
This has
workplace.
made me think of the UK retailer John Lewis, who last year published a staff magazine, which was called Pride in the Partnership, in which there was an article that directed staff whose children were identifying as trans or non-binary towards the charity Mermaids for advice, and was recommending breast binders and things. So,
binders is a very good example of what parents become very distressed about, because binders is kind of pseudo-medical equipment. It's effectively anybody who's pro binders, I immediately say, wear one yourself for a day, then come back to me and tell me how pro binders you are. It's a very, very, very heavy garment. If I wore a binder now, I would be flat. It's like a sheet of steel on your chest. It deforms the breast. So if you wear a binder for some time, your breasts will be deformed. It impacts and actually significantly impairs your breathing, and your lungs will be hurt, and your back will be hurt. An awful lot of teenagers think binding, it's kind of part of the kind of persona of the trans-identified person. And these kids, they can't breathe properly and they're in severe pain. And John Lewis offering breast binders as if this isn't a really painful pseudo-medical equipment that has no research supporting it. It is definitively been proven that this is causing harm, is an example of the lack of knowledge in this area.
Mm. I think from memory, I think that came from the marketing department. So I don't know if that had even come through HR, but you would think that it's definitely a conversation that those two departments should have been having together, which if it happened, then I don't think they came to the right conclusion about what to do there. I also
And if
spent
just one thing, if somebody is working in HR, I urge you, go onto the Genspect YouTube and look at the Detrans Awareness Day, and you'll just listen to a few detransitioners. Once you've listened to a few, you'd realise, oh, if they're in my workplace, they are going to feel really ostracised by my campaign. And then you'll just have a more compassionate, softer, properly inclusive. The very same for the parents. Listen to a few of the parents' stories and you'll realise, hang on, we're going to have to widen our inclusivity here. We can't just be very narrow-minded on this.
Okay, let's talk about the family briefly of the older trans women, so the biological males, the older group that you talked about. So there's a group called trans widows, I think they're called, but the husband isn't dead. What's their situation, and what would life be like for them in the workplace?
So not only do employers need to know about detransitioners, and not only do employers need to know about very distressed, vulnerable parents of very distressed, vulnerable children, they also need to know about trans widows and they need to know about children of transitioners. So trans widows is the phrase for generally women whose husbands maybe they married in their 20s, maybe they had 3 kids, and then their husband, when they were in their 40s or 50s, started to cross dress and then medicalized and became a trans woman. For some of these women, it's fine, but many of them feel devastated. They married a man, they were heterosexual, they fancied the person as a man, and they found that their husband became very often an autogynephile. Very often a paraphilia has arose in their husband, whether it was kept at bay for years or whether it was something that kind of came midlife is debatable depending on the person. Very often there's narcissism involved, very often there's cruelty involved, and there's a complete hyperfixation on the male's need to medically transition and a disregard for the wife in the marriage who is not happy and is often asked to take part in the paraphilic sexual drive. So the male might seek to be called, we're now a lesbian couple, and they want to have what they perceive as lesbian sex with their wife. And it can be very devastating when when you look at that. There's a great book by Shannon Thrace called 18 Months, and she describes how a very androgynous and kind of metrosexual male husband became autogynephile. So they're the trans widows, and they are an angry group. And if you've got a trans widow in your organization, you need to be aware that their lives have been devastated by their partner's paraphilia. And the second group would be children of transitioners. There's a great website called Children of Transitioners, and Emma Thomas, she spoke at our conference in Lisbon in September. And, Emma Thomas gave a brilliant account of what it was like when she was a pubescent girl. She was about 12 or 13, or maybe she was 11, but she was, in that kind of awkward stage of life. And her father started to medically transition. And he was very erotically fixated. He was autogynephile, and he wanted them to be kind of girls together, trying on makeup together, trying on, clothes and underwear together and stuff. It wasn't appropriate. It was profoundly traumatizing and very distressing. If you've got children of transitioners in your workplace, you need to be sensitive to the fact that some of them might be thrilled that their dad transitioned. Some of them might be very happy. Some of them might be utterly devastated, and it might be the most traumatic thing that happened to them. And as a HR person, you need to be aware of both of those. You've got to bring some kind of deeper understanding into this.
Okay, so those are the main groups. I'd say there's also the kind of estranged parents. Some of the older children go off having sort of announced a trans identity, and it's very difficult for the parents. I spoke to a chap actually who was telling me about how he hasn't told anyone at work that his 18-year-old daughter's gone off, and that recently he found out that she was doing a crowdfunder for a double mastectomy. So I think you can just kind of imagine these people in the workplace and how difficult that must be for them. I'm guessing a lot of these groups don't talk to their manager. Do you think most of these groups tend to keep things quiet? I'm guessing things like if you're going through a divorce or your parent dies or you've got a sick child, most people nowadays will tell their manager. But I guess in this case, it seems to be a question of other questions like, how will the manager react? Will they tell other people? Is this going to create more problems than it solves? So I'm guessing all these groups are probably quite private, and it's entirely possible that the employers have no idea that these people are actually in their workforce. And for big employers, it's looking extremely likely, given the numbers of these people, that they are represented within their workforce.
Well, I want to emphasize, if you're a big employer, it's almost inevitable that you definitely have some people that would be very affiliated with Genspect organizations in your workplace. These are parents of distressed kids. These are children of transitioners. These are incredibly unhappy divorced partners whose husbands, frankly, got very absorbed in a fetish. And these are detransitioners who medically transitioned and tried to reverse the process.
Like, how likely would if you've got, say you've got a workforce of 1,000 people, how likely is it that there are parents? How many parents do you think there would be, or how many detransitioners, or how many trans widows, or
We
any
don't
ideas?
have
It's
numbers.
difficult.
Yeah, we don't have numbers. We have thousands in our organization, and there's hundreds of organizations around the world that are kind of talking about it. So the numbers are high, but we have no idea. For example, when I first started following Reddit Detrans, and I urged employers to go and have a look at Reddit Detrans. When I first started following it in 2019, there was less than 1,000 people on that. There's now over 55,000 people on it. So the numbers have surged in recent years. Now, not all of those, the moderators say about 2/3 of those are detransitioners, about a third are people like me. So it's not all detransitioners. But when you read the stories, you'll realize, oh my God, this is common, but it's secretive. Just like at one stage back in the 90s or whatever, people who wanted to medically transition were secretive and it was quiet. Now it's the other side that are secretive. The detransitioners, the unhappy people around, kind of adjacent to the LGBTQ groups, but who are not happy because they love a child who's autistic and who needs help, and they don't think that medical transition is the solution for them. So yeah, there's a lot of very, very unhappy teachers, lawyers, producers, musicians, and they feel like there's only one acknowledged script with LGBTQ, which is it's all positive and it's all good. And there's very little acknowledgement of the many layers of complexity that are often involved.
Mm. I think obviously we're talking mainly about kind of thoughts about kind of cultural inclusion within the workplace. To be a little bit hard nosed for a second, if I may, because actually, what one of the things employers are concerned about is productivity and engagement and performance. And basically, the name of the game for them, we've got a little bit confused in HR at the moment, as you're probably aware, in that we can't quite work out whether we're trying to be lovely to all our employees or whether we fundamentally should consider the organization that we work for and they should be the priority. So there's probably going to be, I think, a swing back to what the hell are we doing here? We actually work for the organization that employs us to work here, and we are supposed to represent them ultimately. And we got into all of this diversity and inclusion stuff. Primarily, it was supposed to be about increasing productivity. Blatantly, if I'm honest, it was all about productivity. And in profit making organizations, that means boosting profit. So everybody makes more money. So we got into this and we got confused about whether we were trying to make the workplace a lovely place for everyone to be themselves or what the hell we were doing. Anyway, basically, that's one of the problems. So I think from what you're saying, I'm hearing people that are stressed out about stuff going on at home do not engage very well at work and they don't perform very well at work. And I can totally see employers thinking that if someone's got this kind of stuff going on at home, that they may be looking for another job, frankly, or that they're not interested in the job anymore, or they don't care, or they didn't really give that project, their full attention. Why has their performance dropped off? So I would think there's probably a performance issue there. I'm also thinking about possibly problems with people not getting on terribly well in the office. So this father that I mentioned of an 18-year-old girl who's identifying as trans actually said that he found the pronouns thing very triggering. Actually, that was his word in the office. He said it creates a barrier, and he said to me, "I know that person would think that I'm transphobic if I told them about my daughter and that we weren't supporting her decision. So I think he felt it was creating a barrier between him and perfectly nice colleagues who thought they were being inclusive, but maybe the message that we're sending isn't always the message that's landing with the other person. I think I can see similar things. You mentioned pride, which I think a lot of employees feel there is an implied demand that for the whole of June they're being asked to celebrate all aspects of what's been called LGBT, which includes this medicalization, hormones and surgery for trans identifying people. I'd imagine, you mentioned it's very difficult for detransitioners and desisters, that we're trying to move on from that culture, and it's just kind of everywhere for a whole month. There's also this lots of gender diversity training. I think there's a little bit less than there was actually. I did notice Trans Awareness Week, which is in November, was much quieter this year. I think Pride was quieter in 2024 as well. So I think people are starting to realise this is a bit more contentious than they realised. For a long time, there wasn't really any quality control around this gender diversity training, and the content didn't seem to have been properly sort of vetted by the employers. So I would say it's certainly worth finding out, if you are going to have somebody coming in, you need to check what they're going to present and whether you've thought about the sort of groups that you've mentioned. It's pretty clear usually in these sessions that external trainers can't really be challenged, and I've certainly seen sessions where kind of non-affirming parents or relatives are referred to as transphobic, which I can imagine was extremely painful to hear if you're sitting in the audience and that's the situation in your family. You're not don't think it's the right path for your child. Also, obviously celebrating trans women as kind of coming out later in life as being their true self is going to be painful for those trans widows and children in those groups as well.
It's happened in schools and it's happened in employment, and it's something that needs to be flagged. There's this kind of pastoral role that employers and schools have taken on, and they've taken it on often out of good intentions because they want productivity, but they also want a happy workforce because it works. It creates better productivity. So I understand and commend the idea behind it. It's not going very well. It's not going very well. This pastoral care isn't actually working out very well. It's brought in an awful lot of people have started organizations, and so they offer workshops in mindfulness and happiness in the workplace and LGBTQ kind of awareness in the workplace. So there's certainly people who are making money from it. I'm not convinced the employers who are employing the workshop givers are making money from it. I'm not convinced the productivity is increasing. And I am convinced that the workshop givers have a kind of a concept to sell almost, whether it's mindfulness, which these days has been called Mac mindfulness, and LGBTQ kind of workshops, which are often offered by trans people who are very invested in creating a world where we recognize that the medicalized approach to trans is the only approach because it's the approach they took, rather than there are other ways to identify. There are other ways to approach gender dysphoria and gender-related distress. And so I think, in a way, I would love a bit of a reset. I'm really glad you're doing this podcast because I would love HR in the larger sense starts to think, what are we here? Are we trying to create a lot of happy individuals who somehow kind of come to work? Are we trying to kind of create a kind of a nice, happy atmosphere in the workplace that is centered on the work, if you follow me? Because the more we bring the complex full self to work, we are going to get effectively an awful lot of flatmates who are living together. And that I want this and you want that and I want this, and you know what I mean? And I get so and so much time in the kitchen and you're not washing up your cup after you, and all of that. It can become so messy because humans are so complex. So I do think that it's actually, work is good for the psyche. Work is good for people. But actually one part of what's good about work is you're purposeful on one subject. You're actually focusing on your work. That's what's good about work. So bringing the whole messiness of your entire self into the workplace is actually bringing a lack of mental health into the workplace. You'd be better off, let's focus on the work. It'll give you a brain space from what's going on elsewhere in life. It won't be so pressurizing that that's all you can think about. But when you're finished work, you'll be able to re-engage with your life in a much more pleasant way because you've actually got a break from it. So there's more than one way to look at this. I have a lot to think about that.
Yeah. And I think it's not it wasn't just about productivity, it was also about recruitment. So I should just mention here about employer branding, which most people outside of recruitment have no idea even exists. So there is such a thing called employer branding, which is very specifically how you position yourself as an employer. And there's an
Hmm.
entire industry around it. And the message coming from them from the last, I would say, 10 years in this space was that this kind of stuff is what young people expect to see from an employer. And so it will help you with your attraction and retention, particularly of university graduates, if you do all this stuff. So I think that began to come in, maybe the sort of events I'm talking about around 2017, 2018. I remember you probably won't know these names, but Havas people and Group GTI began to bring in these ideas that sort of within the kind of marketing realm within early careers recruitment. And I wonder where they got it from. And I'm wondering whether they got it from the big, more generalist marketing companies like Edelman. Havas have got another more general section as well. So all these sorts of ideas were sloshing around. Edelman certainly one of the big PR companies who promoted a lot of messages about young people and their values and ethics and inclusion around that time. And it was very much, this is how you need to behave in order to be competitive as an employer and for the best young people to think you're a great place to work. Ironically, I think they've kind of ended up damaging their employer brand in a way, because if you're not into all of this stuff and you're looking for a new job, say you're a middle-aged woman who's looking for a role in retail, how likely are you to want to go and work at John Lewis? So, in trying to be inclusive, I think they've ended up excluding a whole bunch of people without even realizing it. In terms of solutions, I'm actually moving in the same direction as you are. I was actually going to end this interview by asking you for your sort of suggestions and solutions for employers, and I wondered if you've got some materials for employers which you're working on. But I don't actually think it's for you to solve this problem. It seems pretty clear to me that employers, in their rush to be seen to be supporting their employees who identify as trans, they have kind of, initially without realizing, ended up taking a position on this issue. A kind of political, I suppose, in a way, an ideological position, and they've ended up alienating and excluding other groups in the workforce. So my initial response, I guess, to hearing about the stories from some of these groups is that we need to find better ways to support everybody who's impacted by this issue. But it also actually raises bigger questions about what HR is actually for and whether we ever had a place in any of these conversations in the first place, or whether the whole thing was just a huge mistake from the start. And as a profession, I don't feel HR has covered itself in glory in this case. I know a lot of people are quite angry with us and think we've made some big mistakes. So I guess I think this episode will end up triggering a lot of discussion in the HR world, and not because I think the sky will fall in because this is such a controversial topic. I actually happen to think people are dying to talk about it. They just haven't had the space or a way in. But I think it will trigger some soul searching about whether we have got too much into people's personal lives, when actually we need to reset and re-professionalize that relationship with our employees.
What I was going to say is, what has happened with HR is they've tried to please all the people all the time and found out that it bit them. And I want to urge employers to realize you are taking a position, no matter what it is. Even if your position is not to take a position, well, that's a position. So you're continuously taking a position, and arguably with our Genspect approach, and we do have, for example, policies and sample policies that workers can use and employers can use to kind of create a neutral environment. But what we would say is that's why we would advocate for a low interventionist approach. Cool down, calm down, say less, pull back. Just get yourself out of your employees' lives there a little bit.
Yeah, I sort of agree with you. My question about that is that I think the employers themselves are responsible for the fact that there is now seen as a correct way to look at all this stuff. And they created the water that we're swimming in, which is now very much one perspective. So I agree with you that I don't think we need to be getting into everyone's personal lives all the time. Unfortunately, they themselves have created this problem in a way where there is only one perspective, and it's everywhere within their organization. So I mean, there's loads of legal stuff to talk about as well, to do with policies and practices and things. But I guess maybe one of the first things I would suggest is just hearing for you in terms of action points. I would say check who's coming in to do your events for Pride. and what that's going to look like, and have you cross-referenced it with thinking about these other groups in the workforce? Maybe dial it down a bit this year if if you think you've gone a bit big, and maybe thinking about what policies and practices you've baked into your policy in recent years and whose advice that was, and are you sure it was as inclusive as you believed it was at the time? I think we might need to go back and reassess what we were told in 2017, 2018 with a more critical eye, and consider that if other perspectives are now more easily available, like yours, and that this is looking less like a straightforward civil rights issue and more like something like a belief system that people may or may not subscribe to, in which case, should we be treating it more like any other belief or religion and move away from associating our own organization with having a belief? Was that always rather a weird thing to do, I guess? How do you see that kind of playing out?
Yeah,
Do you
well,
believe more and more people will be more and more aware there are different ways to look at this, and therefore it'll just be a sort of issue that people have different views on, or do you think that your view will end up being the dominant view?
I think, yes, I do think my view will will end up being the dominant view. I do, because it's certainly the healthiest view, which is low interventionist and least invasive first. You know what I mean? Is our priority. However, I do think that employers mostly know that the pastoral HR role has overextended itself. It's overreached and it's bit them. It hasn't gone down well. I do think that there is definitely a role for HR. There's definitely a role for pastoral care, but it's the unnecessary additions that need to be pulled back from. We don't need needless campaigns. We don't need workshops that nobody needs to know about. We don't need, if somebody wants to educate themselves on A, B, or C, they can educate themselves in their free time. This idea that employers have become pseudo schools that are teaching people about various different issues, it's overreaching, and it's always inevitably going to exclude the complexity of the situation. I quite strongly believe that there's been a massive overreach.
Yeah, I think you might find more agreement among the HR community than you might expect on that one, actually. I, do you have any materials or to help guide employers through this topic, or are you working on anything at the moment?
Yeah, we have. What we do is people often write to us and they look for policies. So these would be in the workplace policies around things like toilets and pronouns, and the kind of freedom for one individual to behave in one way and another individual to accept it, kind of balancing the conflicts of rights that can occur and can become very heated and can actually completely lead an employer into disarray if they're not careful. So contact Genspect. We can tailor it to your approach, or we can give you other models, policies that we've sent out to other employers. And some of them are very large employers, and they mightn't put Genspect on their employment, because what they might do is, and I think they're right, they tailor it to theirs. So they use large sections of our policies. So we do have a lot of that. So if you just contact info@genspect.org.
I certainly haven't seen many documents around which cover the sorts of things we've talked about today. In my opinion, a pretty spectacular fail has been that none of the groups that you've talked about are even mentioned in the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, the CIPD, in their trans and non-binary inclusion guides. None of those groups are mentioned at all. I just checked both of them again, so it's not mentioned in the original 2023 guide or the revised 2024 guide, which they slipped out quietly at the end of last year. It's mainly a legal guide, but you would think that these groups would still get a mention in passing. So I think there's a bit of a fail in terms of that. That's the HR industry body within the UK. You're probably not aware there's something of a leadership crisis happening at the CIPD right now. So members are questioning why its CEO receives a £300,000 salary to do a not very good job of running an organisation that seems to have lost its way and doesn't seem to be serving its members terribly well. So, but I think that creates a sense that people can't really trust the sort of gatekeepers to necessarily keep them abreast of everything anymore. So it's for them to go and seek out information if they feel they're missing part of the picture. Anyway, that's really for the HR world to sort out. And I think, I think really in response to this, it'd be really, really good to see how this lands. I think the HR community need to talk about how we're going to reset this issue, and it would be good to get more information from you as we go through that. I think it's pretty clear that we don't have very much leadership within the usual places we would look for it. I mean, I'm happy to coordinate that stuff if anybody wants me to. I'm happy to kind of step up and kind of get those conversations going. But let me see what reaction we get to this podcast, and then perhaps we'll have you on again when we've made a bit of progress and have some things to discuss. Was there anything else that you'd like to say or to add to this conversation, or
No,
any
but
message for employers?
if we were to come on again, I think we should do an FAQ, let employers, send in some questions, and we could do an FAQ, and they'd realise that actually, compassionate policies are available, and they do consider, the conflicts of rights that exist for everybody, and the most appropriate response to each one of these issues. We've really kind of gone very deeply into these ideas that one person wants this, one person wants that. How do we resolve this? And so we created a gender framework, which is due to be published this year, which is all about the different, from hospitals to workplace to schools to all the different environments. How do we handle a conflict of rights if one person thinks this and somebody else thinks that?
There's certainly lots to discuss. I think, as with DEI overall, don't know how much you're following that one as well. We seem to have just created an awful lot of unintended consequences. The road to hell's paved with good intentions. Most of this stuff was started with good intentions. Unfortunately, in my view, there just weren't enough guardrails around it, and we created a culture where it became very difficult to question anything. Now I think we have to question things, because as you say, this is not working, hence the title of this podcast. This isn't working, and we need to talk about why it's not working. And I think actually the private sector, particularly the corporate world, things that are causing them problems, that are costing them money, don't tend to hang around for that long. This kind of thing has hung around for too long, actually. And I mean, if I were you, I would be looking at the corporate world to change direction. I think that those conversations are happening quietly anyway. You can see from the output, and you can see when brands get things wrong and it's not in line with the mood of the consumer or their employees, then they realize that they've made a mistake. So let's see if they can reset, and we can move forward more positively from here. Thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners would have done too. So thank you.
Thank you.